Chapter 26 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. In which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things inseparable from this history are done and performed. The old man had gained the street corner before he began to recover the effect of Toby Crackit's intelligence. He had relaxed nothing of his unusual speed, but was still pressing onward in the same wild and disordered manner, when the sudden dashing past of a carriage, and a boisterous cry from the foot-passengers, who saw his danger, drove him back upon the pavement. Avoiding as much as possible all the main streets, and skulking only through the byways and alleys, he at length emerged on Snow Hill. Here he walked even faster than before, nor did he linger until he had again turned into a court, when, as if conscious that he was now in his proper element, he fell into his usual shuffling pace, and seemed to breathe more freely. Near to the spot on which Snow Hill and Holborn Hill meet, opens upon the right hand as you come out of the city a narrow and dismal alley, leading to Saffron Hill. In its filthy shops are exposed for sale huge bunches of second-hand silk handkerchiefs, of all sizes and patterns, for here reside the traders who purchase them from pickpockets. Hundreds of these handkerchiefs hang dangling from pegs outside the windows, or flaunting from the door-posts, and the shelves within are piled with them. Confined as the limits of Field Lane are, it has its barber, its coffee-shop, its beer-shop, and its fried-fish warehouse. It is a commercial colony of itself, the emporium of petty larceny, visited at early morning and setting in of dusk by silent merchants who traffic in dark back parlours, and who go as strangely as they come. Here the clothesman, the shoe-vamper, and the rag-merchant display their goods as signboards to the petty thief. Here stores of old iron and bones, and heaps of mildewy fragments of woollen stuff and linen, rust and rot in the grimy cellars. It was into this place that the Jew turned. He was well known to the sallow denizens of the lane, for such of them as were on the look-out to buy or sell nodded familiarly as he passed along. He replied to their salutations in the same way, but bestowed no closer recognition until he reached the further end of the alley, when he stopped to address a salesman of small stature, who had squeezed as much of his person into a child's chair as the chair would hold, and was smoking a pipe at his warehouse door. "Why, the sight of you, Mr. Fagin, would cure the hop to me," said this respectable trader, in acknowledgment of the Jew's inquiry after his health. "The neighbourhood was a little too hot lively," said Fagin, elevating his eyebrows, and crossing his hands upon his shoulders. "Well, I've heard that complained of once or twice before," replied the trader, "but it soon cools down again. Don't you find it so?" Fagin nodded in the affirmative. Pointing in the direction of Saffron Hill, he inquired whether any one was up yonder to-night. "At the Cripples?" inquired the man. The Jew nodded. "Let me see," pursued the merchant, reflecting. "Yes, there are some half-dozen of them gone in that I knows. I don't think your friend's there." "Sykes is not, I suppose?" inquired the Jew, with a disappointed countenance. "Non est tuentus, as the lawyers say," replied the little man, shaking his head and looking amazingly shy. "Have you got anything in my line to-night?" "Nothing to-night," said the Jew, turning away. "Are you going up to the Cripples, Fagin?" cried the little man, calling after him. "Stop, I don't mind if I have a drop there with you." But as the Jew, looking back, waved his hand to intimate that he preferred being alone, and moreover, as the little man could not very easily disengage himself from the chair, the sign of the Cripples was, for a time, bereft of the advantage of Mr. Lively's presence. By the time he had got upon his legs the Jew had disappeared, so Mr. Lively, after ineffectually standing on tiptoe, in the hope of catching sight of him, again forced himself into the little chair, and exchanging a shake of the head with a lady in the opposite shop, in which doubt and mistrust were plainly mingled, resumed his pipe with grave demeanour. The Three Cripples, or rather the Cripples, which was the sign by which the establishment was familiarly known to its patrons, was the public house in which Mr. Sykes and his dog have already figured. Merely making a sign to a man at the bar, Fagin walked straight upstairs, and opening the door of a room, and softly insinuating himself into the chamber, looked anxiously about, shading his eyes with his hand as if in search for some particular person. The room was illuminated by two gas lights, the glare of which was prevented by the barred shutters and closely drawn curtains of faded red from being visible outside. The ceiling was blackened to prevent its colour from being injured by the flaring of the lamps, and the place was so full of dense tobacco smoke that at first it was scarcely possible to discern anything more. By degrees, however, as some of it cleared away through the open door, an assemblage of heads, as confused as the noises that greeted the ear, might be made out, and as the eye grew more accustomed to the scene, the spectator gradually became aware of the presence of a numerous company, male and female, crowded round a long table, at the upper end of which sat a chairman with a hammer of office in his hand, while a professional gentleman with a bluish nose, and his face tied up for the benefit of a toothache, presided at a jingling piano in a remote corner. As Fagin stepped softly in, the professional gentleman, running over the keys by way of prelude, occasioned a general cry of order for a song, which having subsided, a young lady proceeded to entertain the company with a ballad in 4 verses, between each of which the accompanist played the melody all through as loud as he could. When this was over, the chairman gave a sentiment, after which the professional gentleman on the chairman's right and left volunteered a duet, and sang it with great applause. It was curious to observe some faces which stood out prominently from among the group. There was the chairman himself, the landlord of the house, a coarse, rough, heavy-built fellow, who, while the songs were proceeding, rolled his eyes hither and thither, and seeming to give himself up to joviality, had an eye for everything that was done, and an ear for everything that was said, and sharp ones too. Near him were the singers, receiving with professional indifference the compliments of the company, and applying themselves in turn to a dozen proffered glasses of spirits and water, tendered by their more boisterous admirers, whose countenances, expressive of almost every vice in almost every grade, irresistibly attracted the attention by their very repulsiveness. Cunning, ferocity, and drunkenness in all its stages were there in their strongest aspect, and women, some with the last lingering tinge of their early freshness almost fading as you looked, others with every mark and stamp of their sex utterly beaten out, and presenting but one loathsome blank of profligacy and crime, some mere girls, others but young women, and none past the prime of life, formed the darkest and saddest portion of this dreary picture. Fagin, troubled by no grave emotions, looked eagerly from face to face while these proceedings were in progress, but apparently without meeting that of which he was in search. Succeeding at length in catching the eye of the man who occupied the chair, he beckoned to him slightly, and left the room as quietly as he had entered it. "What can I do for you, Mr. Fagin?" inquired the man, as he followed him out to the landing. "Won't you join us? They'll be delighted, every one of 'em." The Jew shook his head impatiently, and said in a whisper, "Is he here?" "Now," replied the man. "And no news of Barney?" inquired Fagin. "None," replied the landlord of the Cripples, for it was he. "He won't stir till all's safe. Depend upon it, they're on the scent down there, and that if he moved he'd blow upon the thing at once. He's all right enough, Barney is, else I should have heard of him. I'll pound it that Barney's managing properly, let him alone for that." "Will he be here to-night?" asked the Jew, laying the same emphasis on the pronoun as before. "Monks, do you mean?" inquired the landlord, hesitating. "Hush!" said the Jew. "Yes." "Certain," replied the man, drawing a gold watch from his fob. "I expected him here before now. If you'll wait 10 minutes he'll be—" "No, no," said the Jew hastily, as though, however desirous he might be to see the person in question, he was nevertheless relieved by his absence. "Tell him I came here to see him, and that he must come to me to-night. No, say to-morrow night. As he's not here, to-morrow will be time enough." "Good," said the man. "Nothing more?" "Not a word now," said the Jew, descending the stairs. "I say," said the other, looking over the rails, and speaking in a hoarse whisper, "what a time this would be for a sell! I've got Phil Barker here, so drunk that a boy might take him." "Ah, but it's not Phil Barker's time," said the Jew, looking up. "Phil has something more to do before we can afford to part with him. So go back to the company, my dear, and tell them to lead merry lives, for they'll last." The landlord reciprocated the old man's laugh, and returned to his guests. The Jew was no sooner alone than his countenance resumed its former expression of anxiety and thought. After a brief reflection he called a hack cabriolet and bade the man drive towards Bethnal Green. He dismissed him within some quarter of a mile of Mr. Sikes's residence, and performed the short remainder of the distance on foot. "Now," muttered the Jew as he knocked at the door, "if there's any deep play here, I shall have it out of you, my girl, cunning as you are." She was in her room, the woman said. Fagin crept softly upstairs and entered it without any previous ceremony. The girl was alone, lying with her head upon the table and her hair straggling over it. "She has been drinking," thought the Jew coolly, "or perhaps she's only miserable." The old man turned to close the door as he made this reflection. The noise thus occasioned roused the girl. She eyed his crafty face narrowly as she inquired to his recital of Toby Crackett's story. When it was concluded she sank into her former attitude, but spoke not a word. She pushed the candle impatiently away, and once or twice, as she feverishly changed her position, shuffled her feet upon the ground, but this was all. During the silence the Jew looked restlessly about the room, as if to assure himself that there were no appearances of Sikes having covertly returned. Apparently satisfied with his inspection, he coughed twice or thrice, and made as many efforts to open a conversation, but the girl heeded him no more than if he had been made of stone. At length he made another attempt, and rubbing his hands together, said in his most conciliatory tone, "And where should you think Bill was now, my dear?" The girl moaned out some half-intelligible reply that she could not tell, and seemed from the smothered noise that escaped her to be crying. "And the boy too," said the Jew, straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of her face. "Poor little child, left in a ditch, Nance, only think." "The child," said the girl, suddenly looking up, "is better where he is than among us, and if no harm comes to Bill from it, I hope he lies dead in the ditch, and that his young bones may rot there." "What!" cried the Jew in amazement. "Aye, I do," returned the girl, meeting his gaze. "I shall be glad to have him away from my eyes, and to know that the worst is over. I can't bear to have him about me. The sight of him turns me against myself and all of you." "Pooh!" said the Jew scornfully. "You're drunk." "Am I?" cried the girl bitterly. "It's no fault of yours if I am not. You'd never have me anything else if you had your will, except now the humour doesn't suit you, doesn't it?" "No," rejoined the Jew furiously, "it does not." "Change it, then," responded the girl with a laugh. "Change it!" exclaimed the Jew, exasperated beyond all bounds by his companion's unexpected obstinacy, and the vexation of the night. "I will change it. Listen to me, you drab. Listen to me, who with 6 words can strangle Sikes as surely as if I had his bull's throat between my fingers now. If he comes back and leaves the boy behind him, if he gets off free and dead or alive fails to restore him to me, murder him yourself if you would have him escape Jack Ketch, and do it the moment he sets foot in this room, or on me it will be too late." "What is all this?" cried the girl involuntarily. "What is it?" pursued Fagin, mad with rage. "When the boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me, am I to lose what chance threw me in the way of getting safely, through the whims of a drunken gang that I could whistle away the lives of, and me bound too to a born devil that only wants the will, and has the power to— Panting for breath, the old man stammered for a word, and in that instant checked the torrent of his wrath, and changed his whole demeanour. A moment before his clenched hands had grasped the air, his eyes had dilated, and his face grown livid with passion, but now he shrunk into a chair, and cowering together, trembled with the apprehension of having himself disclosed some hidden villainy. After a short silence he ventured to look round at his companion. He appeared somewhat reassured on beholding her in the same listless attitude from which he had first roused her. "Nancy, dear," croaked the Jew in his usual voice, "do you mind me, dear?" "Don't worry me now, Fagin," replied the girl, raising her head languidly. "If Bill has not done it this time, he will another. He has done many a good job for you, and will do many more when he can, and when he can't, he won't, so no more about that." "Regarding this boy, my dear," said the Jew, rubbing the palms of his hands nervously together. "The boy must take his chance with the rest," interrupted Nancy hastily. "And I say again, I hope he's dead, and out of harm's way, and out of yours, that is, if Bill comes to no harm. And if Toby's got clear off, Bill's pretty sure to be safe, for Bill's worth 2 of Toby any time." "And about what I was saying, my dear," observed the Jew, keeping his glistening eye steadily upon her. "You must say it all over again, if it's anything you want me to do," rejoined Nancy; "and if it is, you had better wait till to-morrow. You put me up for a minute, but now I'm stupid again." Fagin put several other questions, all with the same drift of ascertaining whether the girl had profited by his unguarded hints; but she answered them so readily, and was withal so utterly unmoved by his searching looks, that his original impression of her being more than a trifle in liquor was confirmed. Nancy, indeed, was not exempt from a failing which was very common among the Jew's female pupils, and in which, in their tenderer years, they were rather encouraged than checked. Her disordered appearance, and the wholesale perfume of Geneva which pervaded the apartment, afforded strong confirmatory evidence of the justice of the Jew's supposition; and when, after indulging in the temporary display of violence above described, she subsided first into dulness and afterwards into a compound of feelings, under the influence of which she shed tears one minute, and the next gave utterance to various exclamations of "Never say die," and diverse calculations as to what be the amount of the odds so long as a lady or gentleman was happy, Mr. Fagin, who had had considerable experience of such matters in his time, saw with great satisfaction that she was very far gone indeed. Having eased his mind by this discovery, and having accomplished his twofold object of imparting to the girl what he had that night heard, and of ascertaining with his own eyes that Sikes had not returned, Mr. Fagin again turned his face homeward, leaving his young friend asleep with her head upon the table. It was within an hour of midnight. The weather being dark and piercing cold, he had no great temptation to loiter. The sharp wind that scoured the streets seemed to have cleared them of passengers as of dust and mud, for few people were abroad, and they were, to all appearance, hastening fast home. It blew from the right quarter for the Jew, however, and straight before it he went, trembling and shivering as every fresh gust drove him rudely on his way. He had reached the corner of his own street, and was already fumbling in his pocket for the door key, when a dark figure emerged from a projecting entrance which lay deep in shadow, and, crossing the road, glided up to him unperceived. "Fagin," whispered a voice close to his ear. "Ah," said the Jew, turning quickly around, "is that—" "Yes," interrupted the stranger. "I have been lingering here these 2 hours. Where the devil have you been?" "On your business, my dear," replied the Jew, glancing uneasily at his companion, and slackening his pace as he spoke. "On your business all night." "Oh, of course," said the stranger, with a sneer. "Well, and what's come of it?" "Nothing good," said the Jew. "Nothing bad, I hope," said the stranger, stopping short and turning a startled look upon his companion. The Jew shook his head, and was about to reply, when the stranger, interrupting him, motioned to the house, before which they had by this time arrived, remarking that he had better say what he had got to say under cover, for his blood was chilled with standing about so long, and the wind blew through him. Fagin looked as if he could have willingly excused himself from taking home a visitor at that unreasonable hour, and indeed muttered something about having no fire; but his companion repeating his request in a peremptory manner, he unlocked the door, and requested him to close it softly while he got a light. "It's as dark as the grave," said the man, groping forward a few steps. "Make haste." "Shut the door," whispered Fagin from the end of the passage. As he spoke, it closed with a loud noise. "It wasn't my doing," said the other man, feeling his way. "The wind blew it to, or it shut of its own accord, one or the other. Look sharp with the light, or I shall knock my brains out against something in this confounded hole." Fagin stealthily descended the kitchen stairs. After a short absence he returned with a lighted candle, and the intelligence that Toby Crackit was asleep in the back room below, and that the boys were in the front one. Beckoning the man to follow him, he led the way upstairs. "We can say the few words we've got to say in here, my dear," said the Jew, throwing open a door on the first floor. "And as there are holes in the shutters, and we never show lights to our neighbours, we'll set the candle on the stairs. There." With those words the Jew, stooping down, placed the candle on an upper flight of stairs, exactly opposite to the room door. This done, he led the way into the apartment, which was destitute of all movables save a broken armchair and an old couch or sofa without covering, which stood behind the door. Upon this piece of furniture the stranger sat himself with the air of a weary man, and the Jew drawing up the armchair opposite, they sat face to face. It was not quite dark, the door was partially open, and the candle outside threw a feeble reflection on the opposite wall. They conversed for some time in whispers. Though nothing of the conversation was distinguishable beyond a few disjointed words here and there, a listener might easily have perceived that Fagin appeared to be defending himself against some remarks of the stranger, and that the latter was in a state of considerable irritation. They might have been talking thus for a quarter of an hour or more, when Monks, by which name the Jew had designated the strange man several times in the course of their colloquy, said, raising his voice a little, "I tell you again, it was badly planned. Why not have kept him here among the rest, and made a sneaking, snivelling pickpocket of him at once?" "Only hear him!" exclaimed the Jew, shrugging his shoulders. "Why, do you mean to say you couldn't have done it if you'd chosen?" demanded Monks sternly. "Haven't you done it with other boys scores of times? If you had had patience for a 12-month at most, couldn't you have got him convicted, and sent safely out of the kingdom, perhaps for life?" "Whose turn would that have served, my dear?" inquired the Jew humbly. "Mine," replied Monks. "But not mine," said the Jew submissively. "He might have become of use to me. When there are two parties to a bargain, it is only reasonable that the interests of both should be consulted. Is it, my good friend?" "What then?" demanded Monks. "I saw it was not easy to train him to the business," replied the Jew. "He was not like the other boys in the same circumstances." "Curse him now," muttered the man, "or he would have been a thief long ago." "I had no hold upon him to make him worse," pursued the Jew, anxiously watching the countenance of his companion. "His hand was not in. I had nothing to frighten him with, which we always must have in the beginning, or we labour in vain. What could I do? Send him out with the Dodger and Charlie? We had enough of that at first, my dear. I trembled for us all." "That was not my doing," observed Monks. "No, no, my dear," renewed the Jew. "And I don't quarrel with it now, because if it had never happened, you might never have clapped eyes upon the boy to notice him, and so led to the discovery that it was him you were looking for. Well, I got him back for you by means of the girl, and then she begins to favour him." "Throttle the girl," said Monks impatiently. "Why, we can't afford to do that just now, my dear," replied the Jew, smiling. "And besides, that sort of thing is not in our way, or one of these days I might be glad to have it done. I know what these girls are, Monks, well. As soon as the boy begins to harden, she'll care no more for him than for a block of wood. You want him made a thief. If he is alive, I can make him one from this time, and if, said the Jew, drawing nearer to the other, "it's not likely, mind, but if the worst comes to the worst, and he is dead—" "It's no fault of mine if he is," interposed the other man with a look of terror, and clasping the Jew's arm with trembling hands. "Mind that, Fagin, I had no hand in it. Anything but his death, I told you from the first. I won't shed blood, is always found out, and haunts a man besides. If they shot him dead, I was not the cause. Do you hear me? Fire this internal den, what's that? What?" cried the Jew, grasping the coward round the body with both arms, as he sprung to his feet. "Where?" "Yonder," replied the man, glaring at the opposite wall. "The shadow. I saw the shadow of a woman in a cloak and bonnet pass along the wainscot like a breath." The Jew released his hold, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing where it had been placed. It showed them only the empty staircase and their own white faces. They listened intently. A profound silence reigned throughout the house. "It's your fancy," said the Jew, taking up the light and turning to his companion. "I'll swear I saw it," replied Monks, trembling. "It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke it darted away." The Jew glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and telling him he could follow if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked into all the rooms. They were cold, bare, and empty. They descended into the passage, and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung upon the low walls. The tracks of the snail and slug glistened in the light of the candle, but all was still as death. "What do you think now?" said the Jew, when they had regained the passage. "Besides ourselves, there's not a creature in the house except Toby and the boys. They're safe enough. See here." As a proof of the fact, the Jew drew forth 2 keys from his pocket, and explained that when he first went downstairs he had locked them in to prevent any intrusion on the conference. This accumulated testimony effectually staggered Mr. Monks. His protestations had gradually become less and less vehement as they proceeded in their search without making any discovery, and now he gave vent to several very grim laughs, and confessed it could only have been his excited imagination. He declined any renewal of the conversation, however, for that night, suddenly remembering that it was past 1 o'clock. And so the amiable couple parted. End of chapter 26. Of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter, which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. As it would be by no means seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beadle waiting, with his back to the fire and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him, and as it would still less become his station or his gallantry to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of a maid or matron of whatsoever degree, the historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank, and by consequence great virtues, imperatively claim at his hands. Towards this end, indeed, he had proposed to introduce in this place a dissertation touching the divine right of beadles, and elucidative of the position that a beadle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity, on the arrival of which he will be prepared to show that a beadle properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beadle attached to a parochial workhouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellences and best qualities of humanity, and that to none of those excellences can mere company's beadles, or court of law beadles, or even chapel of ease beadles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar-tongs, made a closer inspection of the milk-pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times, before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking. As there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspaper, speckled with dried lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving in course of time at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which, being shaken, gave forth a pleasant sound as of the clinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and resuming his old attitude, said, with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then he took a view of his legs in profile with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself in a breathless state on a chair by the fireside, and, covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart, and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron, "what is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on. Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "Broken bottles." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I have been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who was dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. "It's them wishes purpose." "It's dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine." "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard, and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and snatching a pint green-glass bottle from the shelf thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint!" exclaimed Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beadle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It's very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beadle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted the Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beadle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking round. "Another room and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney drooped her head when the beadle said this. The beadle drooped his, to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney with great propriety turned her head away, and released her hand to get at her pocket-handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beadle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and a house rent-free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse to-night, my fascinator?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctors say," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What an opportunity for a joining of hearts in housekeepings!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word," said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney." "Yes," sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beadle. "Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms round Mr. Bumble's neck, and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was a irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint. "I'll call at Sowerberry's as I go home, and tell him to send to-morrow morning. Was it that as frightened you, love?" "It wasn't anything particular, dear," said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Won't you tell your own bee?" "Not now," rejoined the lady. "One of these days, after we are married, dear." "After we are married!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "It wasn't any imprudence from any of them male paupers as—" "No, no, love," interposed the lady, hastily. "If I thought it was," continued Mr. Bumble, "if I thought as any one of 'em had dared lift his vulgar eyes to that lovely countenance—" "They wouldn't have dared to do it, love," responded the lady. "They had better not," said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. "Let me see any man, parochial or extra parochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that I wouldn't do it a second time." Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed not a very high compliment to the lady's charms, but as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested with great admiration that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat collar, put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male paupers' ward to abuse them a little, with a view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart, and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlour at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward, and when he saw what was going forward he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper, the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter pot and a wine bottle. At the upper end of the table Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy-chair, with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open clasp-knife in one hand, and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated. These symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties in case of internal fever could have sufficiently accounted. "Here's a delicious fat one, Noah dear," said Charlotte. "Try 'em, do, only this one." "What a delicious thing is an oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is a number of them should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?" "It's quite a cruelty," said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Ain't you fond of oysters?" "Not over much," replied Charlotte. "I like to see you eat them, Noah dear, better than eating them myself." "Law," said Noah reflectively, "how queer." "Have another," said Charlotte. "Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard." "I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss you." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir." Charlotte uttered a scream, and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beadle in drunken terror. "Say it again, you royal audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir? And how dare you encourage him, you insolent minx?" "Kiss her!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation. "Faugh!" "I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a-kissing of me, whether I like it or not." "Oh, Noah!" cried Charlotte reproachfully. "You are, you know you are," retorted Noah. "She's always a-doing of it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love."
"Silence!" cried Mr. Bumble sternly. "Take yourself downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop, and say another word till your master comes home at your peril. And when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he's to send an old woman's shell after breakfast to-morrow morning. Do you hear, sir? Kissing!" cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. "The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone for ever." With these words the beadle strode, with a lofty and gloomy air, from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far on his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. End of chapter 27. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Looks after Oliver and proceeds with his adventures. "Wolves tear your throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was amongst some of you, you'd howl the horser for it." As Sikes growled forth this imprecation with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee, and turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of the men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighbouring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. "Stop, you white-livered hound!" cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. "Stop!" The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with. "Bear a hand with the boy," cried Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back." Toby made a show of returning, but ventured in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. "Quicker!" cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. "Don't play booty with me." At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. "It's all up, Bill," cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show him your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look around, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met it at right angles, and whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound, and was gone. "Ho there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher, Neptune, come here, come here!" The dogs, who, in common with their masters, seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command. Three men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together. "My advice, or leastways I should say my orders is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again." "I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles," said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face, and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. "I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man, "and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him. No, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation." To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke. "You're afraid, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. "I aren't," said Brittles. "You are," said Giles. "You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles," said Brittles. "You're a lie, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. Now these four retorts arose from Mr. Giles's taunt, and Mr. Giles's taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close most philosophically. "I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," he said, "we're all afraid." "Speak for yourself, sir," said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party.
"So I do," replied the man. "It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am." "So am I," said Brittles, "only there's no call to tell a man he is so bounceably." These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who had once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all three faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity, until Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party, and was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping, to make an apology for his hastiness of speech. "But it's wonderful," said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of them rascals." As the other two were impressed with a similar presentiment, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament. "I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate." "I shouldn't wonder if it was," exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea. "You may depend upon it," said Giles, "that gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it." By a remarkable coincidence the other two had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars, and a travelling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse, and who had been roused, together with his two mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion. Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the three men hurried back to a tree, behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up the light, they made the best of their way home at a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, the light might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as the day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways and low places were all mire and water. The damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by with a hollow moaning. Still Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing as its first dull hue, the death of night rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes. But Oliver felt it not as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched helpless and unconscious on his bed of clay. At length a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavily and useless at his side. The bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture. When he had done so, he looked feebly round for help, and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man; but he kept up nevertheless, and with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as on the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms. There rose into the air loud cries and shouts, lights gleamed before his eyes, all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of gates, or through hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road. Here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew nearer to this house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall. On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night, and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place, that for the instant he forgot the agony of his wound, and thought only of flight. Flight he could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, whither could he fly? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked, and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that about this time Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves, after the fatigues and terrors of the night, with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to too great familiarity with the humbler servants, towards whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary make all men equals, so Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his bearers, but especially the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30," said Mr. Giles, "or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3, when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so—" Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair, and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to imitate bedclothes. "I fancied I heard a noise." At this point of the narrative the cook turned pale, and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first, 'This is illusion,' and was composing myself off to sleep, when I heard the noise again, distinct." "What sort of noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittles. "It was when you heard it, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles, "but at this time it had a busting sound. I turned down the clothes," continued Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, "sat up in bed, and listened." The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated "Lor!" and drew their chairs closer together. "I heard it now quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody, I says, is forcing of a door or window. What's to be done? I'll call up the poor lad Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat, says I, may be cut from his right ear to his left, without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker, and stared at him with his mouth wide open, and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth, and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of—" "A lady's present, Mr. Giles," murmured the tinker. "Of shoes, sir," said Giles, turning upon him and laying great emphasis on the word, seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. "Brittles," I says, when I had woke him, "don't be frightened." "So you did," observed Brittles in a low voice. "We're dead men, I think, Brittles," says I, continued Giles, "but don't be frightened." "Was he frightened?" asked the cook. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Giles. "He was as pretty near as firm as I was." "I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me," observed the housemaid. "You're a woman," retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. "Brittles is right," said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. "From a woman nothing else was to be expected. We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittle's hob, and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so." Mr. Giles had risen from his seat, and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut, to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed. "It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. "It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning," said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear? Somebody." Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles, after a short silence, "I am ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party being somewhat reassured by the discovery, made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front. The 2 women, who were afraid to stay below, brought up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm, to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed. The group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles valiantly, pushing the tinker into the background. "What's the matter with the— why, Brittles, look here, don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall, and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is," bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am. Here's a thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light." "In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth, so that his voice might travel the better. The 2 women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavouring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt?" "Wounded desperate, miss," replied Giles, with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he was a-going, miss," bawled Brittles in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the lady. "Wait quietly only one instant while I speak to aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away. She soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and doctor. "But won't you take one look at him first, miss?" asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver was some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss?" "Not now for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. Chapter 28. Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Has an introductory account of the inmates of the house, to which Oliver is restored. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast-table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some half-way between the sideboard and the breakfast-table, and with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side, grasping a waiter, looked like one who laboured under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner, with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were attentively upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mould, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eyes, and was stamped upon her noble head, seemed scarcely of her age, or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humour, the thousand lights that played about the face, and left no shadow there, above all, the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home and fireside peace and happiness. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table. Chancing to raise her eyes as the older lady was regarding her, she playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on the forehead, and threw into her beaming look such an expression of affection and artless loveliness, that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her. "And Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?" asked the old lady after a pause. "An hour and 12 minutes, ma'am," replied Giles, referring to a silver watch which he drew forth by a black ribbon. "He is always slow," remarked the old lady. "Brittles always was a slow boy, ma'am," replied the attendant; and seeing by the by that Brittles had been a slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one. "He gets worse instead of better, I think," said the elder lady. "It is very inexcusable of him if he stops to play with any other boys," said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging in a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and who, getting quickly into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast-table together. "I never heard of such a thing!" exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of the night too! I never heard of such a thing!" With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing up a chair, inquired how they found themselves. "You ought to be dead, positively dead with the fright," said the fat gentleman. Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances. Oh dear, dear, so unexpected! In the silence of the night, too!" The doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected, and attempted in the night time, as if it were the established custom of gentlemen in the house-breaking way to transact business at noon, and to make an appointment by post a day or two previous. "And you, Miss Rose?" said the doctor, turning to the young lady. "Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him. "But there is a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see." "Ah, to be sure," replied the doctor, "so there is. That was your handiwork, Giles, I understand." Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had had the honour. "Honour, eh?" said the doctor. "Well, I don't know. Perhaps it's as honourable to hit a thief in the back kitchen as to hit your man at 12 paces. Fancy that he fired in the air, and you fought a duel, Giles." Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for the like of him to judge about that, but that he rather thought it was no joke to the opposite party. "Gad, that's true," said the doctor. "Where is he? Show me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Mrs. Maylie. That's the little window he got in at, eh? Well, I couldn't have believed it." Talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles upstairs, and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Losburn, a surgeon in the neighbourhood, known through the circuit of 10 miles round as the doctor, had grown fat more from good humour than from good living, and was as kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric, an old bachelor as will be found in 5 times that space by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. A large flat box was fetched out of the gig, and the bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it was justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient looked very mysterious, and closed the door carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door, as if to keep it shut. "He is not in danger, I hope?" said the old lady. "Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing under the circumstances," replied the doctor, "though I don't think he is. Have you seen the thief?" "No," rejoined the old lady. "Nor heard anything about him?" "No." "I beg your pardon, ma'am," interposed Giles, "but I was going to tell you about him when Dr. Losburn came in." The fact was that Giles had not at first been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he had only shot a boy. Such commendations had been bestowed upon his bravery that he could not for the life of him help postponing the explanation for a few delicious minutes, during which he had flourished at the very zenith of a brief reputation for undaunted courage. "Rose wished to see the man," said Mrs. Maylie, "but I wouldn't hear of it." Rejoined the doctor, "there's nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it is necessary," said the doctor. "At all events, I'm quite sure you would deeply regret not having done so if you postponed it. He is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose. Will you permit me?" "Not the slightest fear, I'll pledge you my honour." End of chapter 29. Of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. Relates what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. With many loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, and offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, led them with much ceremony and stateliness upstairs. "Now," said the doctor in a whisper, as he softly turned the handle of the bedroom door, "let us hear what you think of him. He has not been shaved very recently, but he don't look at all ferocious notwithstanding. Stop, though. Let me first see that he is in visiting order." Stepping before them, he looked into the room. Motioning them to advance, he closed the door when they had entered, and gently drew back the curtains of the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. His wounded arm, bound up and splintered, was crossed upon his chest. His head reclined upon the other arm, which was half hidden by his long hair, as it streamed over the pillow. The honest gentleman held the curtain in his hand and looked on for a minute or so in silence. Whilst he was watching the patient thus, the younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face. As she stooped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of a love and affection he had never known. Thus a strain of gentle music, or the rippling of water in a silent place, or the odour of a flower, or the mention of a familiar word, will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were in this life, which vanish like a breath, which some brief memory of a happier existence long gone by would seem to have awakened, which no voluntary exertion of the mind can ever recall. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers." "Vice," said the surgeon, replacing the curtain, "takes up her abode in many temples, and who can say that a fair outside shall not enshrine her?"
"But at so early an age," urged Rose.
"My dear young lady," rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head, "crime, like death, is not confined to the old and withered alone. The youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims."
"But can you really believe that this delicate boy has been the voluntary associate of the worst outcasts of society?"
said Rose. The surgeon shook his head in a manner which intimated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led the way into an adjoining apartment.
"But even if he has been wicked," pursued Rose, "think how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or the comfort of a home; that ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake think of this before you let them drag this sick child to a prison, which in any case must be the grave of all his chances of amendment. Oh, as you love me, and know that I have never felt the want of parents in your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected with this poor child, have pity upon him before it is too late."
"My dear love," said the elder lady, as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom, "do you think I would harm a hair of his head?"
"Oh no," replied Rose eagerly.
"No, surely," said the old lady. "My days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I do to save him, sir?" "Let me think, ma'am," said the doctor. "Let me think." Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets, and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes, and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of "I've got it now," and "No, I haven't," and as many renewals of the walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt, and spoke as follows: "I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bully Giles and that little boy Brittles, I can manage it. Giles is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make it up to him in 1,000 ways, and reward him for being such a good shot besides. You don't object to that?"
"Unless there is some other way of preserving the child," replied Mrs. Maylie.
"There is no other," said the doctor, "no other, take my word for it."
"Then my aunt invests you with full power," said Rose, smiling through her tears. "But pray don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary."
"You seem to think," retorted the doctor, "that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted to-day except yourself, Miss Rose. I only hope, for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in as vulnerable and soft-hearted a mood by the first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion. And I wish I were a young fellow, that I might avail myself, on the spot, of such a favourable opportunity for doing so as the present."
"You are as great a boy as poor Brittles himself," returned Rose, blushing.
"Well," said the doctor, laughing heartily, "that's no very difficult matter. To return to this boy, the great point of our agreement is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I daresay, and although I have told that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that he mustn't be moved or spoken to, on peril of his life, I think we may converse with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation: that I shall examine him in your presence, and that if from what he says we can judge, and I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reason, that he is a real and thorough bad one, which is more than possible, he shall be left to his fate, without any further interference on my part, at all events." "Oh, no, aunt," entreated Rose. "Oh, yes, aunt," said the doctor. "Is it a bargain?" "He cannot be hardened in vice," said Rose. "It is impossible." "Very good," retorted the doctor. "Then so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition." Finally the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereunto sat down to wait with some impatience until Oliver should awake. The patience of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial than Mr. Losburne had led them to expect, for hour after hour passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he was at length sufficiently restored to be spoken to. The boy was very ill, he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to disclose something that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon his remaining quiet until next morning, which he should otherwise have done. The conference was a long one. Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear in the darkened room the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures we bestowed but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which, like dense and heavy clouds, are rising, slowly it is true, but not less surely, to heaven, to pour their after vengeance on our heads; if we heard but one instant in imagination the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle and no pride shut out, where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by gentle hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him as he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded, and Oliver composed to rest again, than the doctor, after wiping his eyes, and condemning them for being weak all at once, betook himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles; and finding nobody about the parlours, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen, so into the kitchen he went. There were assembled, in that lower house of the domestic parliament, the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day, in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half boots, and he looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the doctor entered. Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it. "Sit still," said the doctor, waving his hand. "Thank you, sir," said Mr. Giles. "Missis wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I felt no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and was disposed for company, I am taking mine among 'em here." Brittles headed a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles's condescension. Mr. Giles looked round with a patronizing air, as much as to say that so long as they behaved properly he would never desert them. "How is the patient to night, sir?" asked Mr. Giles. "So," returned the doctor. "I am afraid you have got yourself into a scrape there, Mr. Giles." "I hope you don't mean to say, sir," said Giles, trembling, "that he's going to die. If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off, no, not even Brittles there, not for all the plate in the county, sir." "That's not the point," said the doctor mysteriously. "Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant?" "Yes, sir, I hope so," faltered Giles, who had turned very pale. "And what are you, boy?" said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles. "Lord bless me, sir," replied Brittles, starting violently, "I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir." "Then tell me this," said the doctor, "both of you, are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that that boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it, come, we are prepared for you." The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction. "Pay attention to the reply, constable, will you?" said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner, and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's utmost acuteness. "Something may come of this before long." The constable looked as wise as he could, and took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner. "It's a simple question of identity, you will observe," said the doctor. "That's what it is, sir," replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry, and some of it had gone the wrong way. "Here's the house broken into," said the doctor, "and a couple of men catch one moment's glimpse of a boy in the midst of gunpowder smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness. Here's a boy comes to the very same house next morning, and because he happens to have his arm tied up, these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in great danger, and swear he is the thief. Now, the question is, whether these men were justified by the fact. If not, in what situation do they place themselves?" The constable nodded profoundly. He said, if that wasn't law, he would be glad to know what was. "I ask you again," thundered the doctor, "are you, on your solemn oaths, able to identify that boy?" Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles, the constable put his hand behind his ear to catch the reply, the two women and the tinker leaned forward to listen, the doctor glanced keenly round, when a ring was heard at the gate, and at the same moment the sound of wheels. "It's the runners!" cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved. "The what?" exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn. "The Bow Street officers, sir," replied Brittles, taking up a candle. "Me and Mr. Giles sent for him this morning." "What?" cried the doctor. "Yes," replied Brittles, "I sent a message up by the coachman, and I only wonder they weren't here before, sir." "You did you? Then confound your slow coaches down here. That's all," said the doctor, walking away. Chapter 30